Good afternoon, and welcome to the third and final day of Bristol BookFest 2020. I'm Charles Calhoun, one of the members of the steering committee, and I'm very happy to have all of you with us here today. And a special greeting from Rhode Island to those of you who are listening out of state. If you weren't here the first 2 days, you missed some fantastic speakers. You can go on the Rogers Free Library YouTube channel and listen to what you missed. And I urge you to do so if you're so inclined. If you weren't here the first 2 days, I also wanted to just review the journal format. We will be hearing from our first speaker in a few moments for about an hour, maybe 40 minutes of his speaking, and then some time for questions. You can send questions to us through the chat box feature on your Zoom page. And those will be relayed to me, and I will ask the speaker to reply. We'll take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back for the final part of the program, which will be a group panel discussion, a free-ranging discussion on the part of all our presenters. And at the end of the day, we will announce next year's book selection for BookFest 2021. So please stay tuned. I especially want to thank those of you who have been watching and listening, for those, especially to those who sent in some very kind messages about how much you appreciated what you had heard and how great you thought these three academics were. It's a reminder that there are some amazing professors out there in our colleges and universities. I wouldn't say they're wasted on 18-year-olds, but there's another audience for them too, which is us. We listen to them perhaps in a different way, bringing our own life experiences. And I think that's at the heart of what we're trying to do here in these BookFest programs, to make this link between the academy and the general reading public, the serious reading public. And this is just a start. It didn't turn out quite the way we had anticipated, obviously, but we're not going to let a little virus stop this wonderful program. So here we are online, and I thank you for all your patience and cooperation in making this work. I would also just say that any opinions you hear expressed today are those of the speakers or the people asking questions. They're not any kind of official position of Bristol BookFest. Let me introduce our speaker, who should have been the keynote if this program had taken place last March as planned. He would have kicked the whole thing off. Instead, he is the grand finale. And I think that's going to work just as well. But I appreciate George's flexibility in making this change. I've known George Shipley, I don't know, half a century now, I suppose. And I remember him as a very fresh-faced young man from Houston, arriving at the University of Virginia, where I think I was a year or two ahead of him. And I can still see him walking down Rugby Road from one fraternity house to another. And this was the bad old days. UVA was all male, very Southern, very fraternity dominated, et cetera, et cetera. And George was just a natural at college politics. I mean, to some degree, we're all political junkies, but he, even at age 17 or 18, whatever he was eating, breathing, sleeping, dreaming politics. It was a vocation, it was clear to him, and he was very, very good at it. The problem at that point was that these college elections, involved no issues. There was nothing really important to be arguing about. So it was all a matter of finding the right candidates, how popular they were, did they look the part, could you log roll their fraternities and form coalitions of other fraternities and all that sort of thing. And George was just a master at it. And I thought maybe this was just his hobby, because I didn't see him for a number of years. But then word slipped out that after a little bit of time in academia and on Capitol Hill, he'd gone back to Texas and had launched an amazing initiative on his part as a political consultant and advisor and pollster, et cetera, and fundraiser, et cetera, et cetera. And even now in retirement, he is volunteering his time to a number of political campaigns in Texas that are going on right now. I saw that the Washington Post yesterday had said Texas is the most interesting state to watch in the next 2 weeks. to see what is going on there and how it may turn out. So we've asked George this afternoon, to reflect on his life in Southern politics and Texas politics, perhaps to explain the difference between the two or how they overlap, to look at the Huey Long phenomenon in the 1920s and 30s and to see if it has any relevance to what's going on today in terms of either populism or demagoguery, and to try to pull all this together from his extraordinary fund of anecdotes and experiences on the political scene, and probably one of the most colorful political scenes any of us could possibly imagine. So I'm very happy to welcome today to Bristol Book Fest, George Shipley, who is joining us from his home in Austin, Texas. Thank you, George.
Charlie, thank you very much. I'm honored and privileged that you all would consider and have me here. I have kind of a checkered career. I left the university, went off to a graduate school, wanted to teach academics. I was the dog that caught the car. I put off working and got a series of postdoctoral fellowships, ended up working in the US Senate, worked there for 5 years and came back, taught at UT, decided I didn't really have the love of poverty and scholarship simultaneously. So I built a business doing political consulting around. I worked for the Democrats. I tried to retire once and that lasted 6 weeks. So I'm back doing it. Before we get going about the South and Huey Long and some other things, I might report to you that as of Thursday morning, Biden is 2 points ahead in Texas of Trump, and we think we're going to win it. And it's kind of an interesting experience, I must say. I also think that the Senate race here is very, very close for those of you following that, and we might talk about some of that in the 2020 and by way of conclusion. So to start this, in talking about the South and so on, it might be useful to reflect a little bit, and I know you all had a great weekend, a little bit about who Huey Long was very quickly, and two or three aspects of Long that perhaps we forget. His Share the Wealth program actually became the model for many elements in the Second New Deal, as most of you know. Social Security, veterans benefits, also some lesser known things such as employee ownership of corporations and so forth. What makes Long exceptional in the pantheon of Southern demagogues and so forth is that he was not a segregationist, and he did not buy into the usual race baiting that was so typical and still is typical today of much of Southern politics. And we'll talk about some of that and so forth. Long was a genuine populist who believed in share the wealth and who in many areas was ahead of his time, as I'm going to argue here in a second. Inevitably, popular historians and journalists today will compare Huey Long to Donald Trump. And they will argue that Trump is a right-wing populist, that Trump set about masses and elites and so forth. But therein, the comparisons stop, and we'll return to those comparisons towards the end. I think in order to do this, though, I'd like to kind of set the stage for a quick look at Southern politics, sort of the myths of Southern politics or the classic of it. Then we'll look at Southern politics in 2020. And by Southern politics, I mean the politics in those states which were part of the Confederacy. It's typical for political scientists to argue that they're the sort of inner states and the outer ring. I'll leave it to you to figure it all out. But typically, the two things about Southern politics that any social scientist will tell you that make it different are the racism and the prevalence of race-based politics of various kinds. And they range from the 1890s to Pitchfork, from the days of Pitchfork Ben Tillman to George Wallace to the modern demagogues of today. To example, even as late as Friday, Senator Perdue made a racist comment about Senator Harris in Atlanta, and we'll talk about some of that in a little bit. But the first and predominant characteristic of Southern politics is race, and we'll come back to some of that. The second one is the preeminence of evangelicals. One half of all of the evangelicals in the United States live in the states of the old Confederacy. So the predominant religious ethos is that of fundamentalism. It's the home of Bob Jones University. It's the home of the Falwells, Franklin Graham. We'll talk about some of that in a little bit. It is also the home of American bigotry towards Muslims, of defense of the Iraqi war, of homophobia, of anti-abortion sentiments, of support for taxpayers, support for public schools, and so forth. And the marriage of fundamentalism, evangelical fundamentalism, and the racism itself. Various historians have argued that these were the preconditions that led to the rise of the Tea Party movement in the 1990s throughout the South, and the creation of characters such as Newt Gingrich and so forth. And that the rise of the Tea Party led to the nationalization of what we might call Southern Republicanism. And it permeated as a predecessor, if you will, to the sort of Trump takeover of the Republican Party. If we look at the Southern Republican Party of the 1960s and 1970s, we see that the party is controlled the suburbs, that it was widely acceptance of the soft racism of Richard Nixon, of law and order politics, that business as usual was anti-worker, anti-union, anti-consumer, that the white majorities installed as many laws as they could to preserve themselves in power, that the racial politics of the early 1960s were characterized by, for example, massive resistance in Virginia, the busing disputes and issues throughout the South, and then later, in the 1960s, the counter-revolution such as was in the civil rights movements throughout the South. That the predominant figures in the South in the 1960s and mid-1970s, the names that come to mind besides George Wallace, every one of them was a segregationist, whether it was James O. Eastland or John Stennis or Herman Talmadge, or to a lesser extent, Huey's relative, Russell Long, in some ways, whom we'll talk about a little bit, or Harry Byrd in Virginia, we could talk about. Massive resistance to civil rights, the preservation of property rights, and government by business. The politics of religion in the South were equally restrictive and fundamentalist. These were the days when Billy Graham, of course, did his Hour of Power and Blessed Assurance and all the rest of it. And Jerry Falwell ran the moral majority. I'm going to interject with a story about Falwell that you all would love. That in 1980, when Reagan was president, the leading financial institutions in the South, a lot of them were known as savings and loans, which specialized in home mortgages. Many of these savings and loans were overly capitalized and were involved in fairly chicanery things and basically stealing from their customers. When in the first 2 years of the Reagan administration, the Attorney General for President Reagan held a party for the moral majority. Reagan would never take their money, but Falwell was the guest of honor, where all of the savings and loans folks in Texas, at least throughout the South, were expected to make contributions, and you've never seen quite so many salvation efforts there. The moral majority was an arm of the Reagan Republicanism for years and years and years until Thornberry became Attorney General, and then he prosecuted them all and put a number of them in jail. But these were the days of Graham, Tammy Faye Baker, Falwell Sr., and of evangelical Christians. It was a variation of what we might call kind of the gospel of wealth, if you will. The modern heirs of these people exist today. You all see them in the South. Those of you who follow the politics of religion know the name of Robert Jeffords, the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Dallas, who is he is uniquely suited, I suppose, for that job. He's both an anti-Muslim and an anti-Semite and a virtual racist. He is Donald Trump's favorite preacher today. And of course, Franklin Graham, who is the son of Billy Graham, who is the most devoted of all, who believes that President Trump is divinely inspired by God, that he is the, quote, chosen one, which we could discuss, I suppose, at length and so forth. And you all are aware of the problems associated with some of these characters, with Falwell's kid at Liberty University and so forth. The politics of religion, the politics of race are the two defining cultural characteristics, I believe, of traditional understanding of the politics of the South. And the days of backroom deals, the days when the civil rights movement was something to be dealt with. If we look at, if we fast forward to the current state of Southern politics today, we can see, going by the states, we can see that that the emergence of the so-called New South is somewhat erratic. That the Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, is a staunch Donald Trump Republican and a fierce advocate of voter suppression, and has done all that he can to keep the turnout down. Ron DeSantis, very conservative in Florida, another Trump Republican. Harry McMaster in South Carolina, a third Trump Republican. Tate Reeves is a special case in Mississippi. He's the fraternity boy who was an out-and-out racist, and yet another one. Arkansas, Asa Hutchinson. In Texas, our governor is a Trump Republican who denies it in public, is a good way to put it. But if we look at these states today, this so-called New South, we're setting aside the race, where governments have become genuinely integrated, where they're becoming progressive. We can look at Virginia, which has been fueled by the influx of northern populations with Governor Ralph Northam, and North Carolina under Governor Cooper, and Louisiana under Governor John Bel Edwards. One of the things that defines these states today, if you will think about it, is this. The states under Republican control have all been irresponsible in the management of the COVID disease. They have all rejected masks. They have rejected closure. They have rejected social distancing. They are followers of the most irresponsible aspects of the Trump COVID management that you can imagine. These Trump Republicans have contributed to more death and sickness possibly than any other group of people in the 21st century, and certainly going back 100 years. They are in the best traditions of Southern followers. And I would put it to you that that they will be there after Trump leaves in some ways. So change in the South has been erratic, and it's come only in response to particular challenges. So that if we look at where the change is coming from today, we can argue that actually Donald Trump has made a contribution to change in the South, because what we have is very hot races for the United States Senate. We have two in Georgia, which are very close. That Senator Perdue is now a few points behind John Ossoff. That Mike Espy is a point or two behind his opponent in Mississippi. Here in Texas, I think John Cornyn is down a couple of points to MJ Hagar, a U.S. military veteran, and so forth. So that what Trump has done is to take the women who are staunch parts of the Republican base, and he has introduced, probably more effectively than any other thing that could have happened, a two-party system to some of these southern states, so that the reliably red states today are now on the verge of being purple or absolutely being changing up. And we can go through some of the races and take a look at it. Virginia today has two Democratic senators, a Democratic governor, and it is reliably blue. North Carolina is on the bubble, but it's, I think, about to throw out its Republican senator. South Carolina, you all read about Lindsey Graham and so forth. Trump will carry South Carolina, but Graham is within 2 points, and on and on and on. The point here is that the Southern call for change, which is partially generation-based, also, I think, borrows some of those lessons from Huey Long of setting aside race and moving to a more equitable distribution of resources in some ways. So that if we look at the New South today, I think what we're going to see is increased two-party competition, and I think we're going to see some Democratic senators here in a couple of weeks, which I think is very interesting. Now, historians talk about in the popular literature about Trump being an heir to Huey Long. And in some cases, there are some kind of superficial parallels to Long. Both had a slogan, MAGA and every man a king. Both used sweeping populist rhetoric, and both came to prominence by rejecting the quote rule of law and legal procedures, and both were accused of being fascists. And perhaps Long is much more effectively in some ways than Trump. They also argued they pitted elites against the common people, and they argued for, at least Long more convincingly than Trump, for some sort of redistribution of the wealth in the country, so that the Long, but Long was not, as I said, a race baiter, and of course Trump is, and that Long's national agenda, share the wealth, was in many ways, I think, so progressive. So the character, so the breakdown, they break down, the comparisons break down, I think, in some ways. I have many stories to share with you, but I want to conclude a couple of things, and then we'll take some questions. First thing I might just kind of observe, some of you, I think, have probably had occasion to look at Huey Long's Share Our Wealth program, but it had 8 key points to it, and it's very interesting to recite it from time to time. Long said that no person would be allowed to accumulate personal wealth more than 300 times the average family fortune, that annual income would be limited to $1 million, inheritances would be capped, every family was to be given a homestead allowance, there would be an old age pension available to all persons over 60. And that, in fact, is the germ of the idea of Social Security, that to balance agricultural production, the government should preserve surplus goods, which was really the creation of Roosevelt's Department of Agriculture programs. He Long envisioned a veterans pension program, which was the origin of the VA. He envisioned free education and training, and he also envisioned a tax system that would come from the reduction of the stolen fortunes at the top, to quote it. If you thought about some of this and the parallels, I would tell you that it sounds a little bit like the Democratic platform of 2020, that those will say, like John Meacham, things, history doesn't repeat itself, it simply rhymes, that there are no new ideas in life, would look at these things and say, well, this is sort of where the Democrats are coming in a share of the wealth program. The difference, of course, is that Donald Trump is a danger to this country, and that no one ever questioned Huey Long's loyalty to the United States. So therein, I think the breakdown is there. This is obviously the most important election in our lifetimes, and for the South, it presents many opportunities, and the effects of these elections, I think, will be felt a long time. And I'll take some questions at this point, and Charlie, if we could kind of go from there. I can't hear you, Charlie. You have.
Is that better?
There, better. There we go.
Yes. Thank you for that overview. That's very helpful. I was wondering, well, a couple of things popped into my mind, so I'll ask those questions first as the other questions come in. Where was Long getting all this this platform from? I mean, he didn't have a brain trust, presumably.
It came from his own head. He saw Louisiana was controlled by the oil and gas industry and the real estate industry, and what he saw was the unmitigated purloining of public wealth, and he saw that the state of Louisiana was not receiving any oil and gas royalties. There were no hospitals, there were no roads, that there were no schools. It was a fairly easy thing to imagine a better place to go.
Mm-hmm. Had he not been assassinated, do you think FDR could have stopped him in some fashion? Or?
Well, you know, who knows? It's a counterfactual. Roosevelt regarded him as the most dangerous man in America, second most dangerous after Father Coughlin, I think. And Long was thought to be a fascist, that he did not respect the rule of law. He did not respect the court system. He just reached out and took what he wanted and used the police to do it. I see somebody's made a motion. It was MacArthur, not Coughlin. I had them confused. But Long did not respect, but Long was also an isolationist. He did not have a sense of international progress, of international collective security or anything of that notion. I do think Roosevelt would have beat him. I think that the machines of the Democratic Party in the North, in the cities, would have destroyed Long politically.
When we use words like fascist these days, what do we mean by that?
Use of the military to appropriate the policy, to create and implement policy without due process of law is the simple way to look at it. It's a simple way. It's an authoritarian scheme where involving dictatorship, where the dictator uses the military and other instruments for personal direct control without any recourse to the courts or civil liberties. That's a simple think about it.
Can you say something? This is a question has come in from a listener. Can you say something about the difference between the real Huey Long, the historical Huey Long, and the depiction of Willie Stark in Warren's novel? Who he's in some ways a caricature, but honestly,
people of Louisiana. I think Long was actually more popular even when he was shot. The average common people in Louisiana, to this day, he and his family are very, very popular with ordinary working people in Louisiana. That the elites hated him, the wealthy people hated him, the intellectuals hated him because of his corruption, but that he was popular, as popular as he could have been. And you know, whether he would have made it as president, I rather think not. But you know, mainly because the Democratic Party at that time was controlled by the big city bosses, and those were Frank FDR's buddies. Those were the governors and senators in the North, and they were not going to have any Southern cracker in the White House. And Long was considered dangerous. He was just not reliable, if you will.
Yeah. You mentioned Russell Long in passing, and you must have met him in your.
I did. I'll tell you a quick. When I first started working in the Senate, it was the late 1970s, right during Watergate. I started as a very junior staffer to United States Senator Lloyd Bentsen from Texas. And Bentsen was in his first term and was a member of the Finance Committee. The chairman of the Finance Committee at that time was Russell Long. And I'll begin with a fun story and then tell you some more serious ones. I was a very young guy and I was very bright. But I knew it all. I had a PhD and I was a professional fellow and wandering around. So I got these chores to do. And the fellow walked up. The campaign finance laws evolving out of Watergate had just been implemented. That required reporting of money. You couldn't use checks. You couldn't use bogus committees. It was the first stab at financial accountability in campaign finance coming out of Watergate. So in 1974, when I was working there, the laws had just been passed 8 months ago. A fellow came up to the Russell Senate office building where I had an office. I worked in Senator Bentsen's office. And in those days, you could have political aides. So this guy comes up and he came to me and he said, I was detailed to talk to him and see what he wanted. He said, "My name is Jules LeBlanc. I'm from Baton Rouge. And Russell sent me," and he handed me a stack of money, of checks and cash. So I don't know what it was, $7,000 or $8,000, but it was $100 bills. And it was, I was frightened of the whole deal. I had no idea what to do. So I said, "Mr. LeBlanc, I can't take this money. You're on federal property. The laws are such that I can't accept this. I'm very sorry." And he said, he was completely insulted. He said, "Do you understand Chairman Long sent that down to Lloyd? And I'm supposed to deliver this money. I'm gonna get in trouble." I said, "I cannot do it, sir. I'm very sorry." And he stalks off. And we, about 30 minutes later, went into a staff meeting. By coincidence, Senator Bentsen would periodically meet with his staff, about 30 people. And in the middle of the meeting, Bentsen had a red phone connected to Long's, and the phone rang. And Bentsen was, of course, properly deferential to his chairman. "Yes, Mr. Chairman." "What? That man did what, Mr. Chairman? I can't believe he was that stupid." And he goes on and then he says, I'll take care of it immediately. I'll fire him immediately. That's terrible. Please tell Mr. LeBlanc to come back and we'll deal with him. So Benson looks at me and I thought I was fired and everybody's looking around. Shipley, ha ha, you're gone. And Benson just smiles and he says, don't go near Long's office for 30 days. He'll forget it. Don't worry about a thing. And he sent out a qualified aide to deal with LeBlanc and mollify him, get it down. Well, that was my first experience. And later I got to know Long. Benson actually ran briefly for president in 1976 and sought the Democratic nomination. That was the year that Carter ran and Scoop Jackson and Sergeant Shriver and various people. And so we were bouncing around the country and Benson got Long to, Senator Russell Long, to do a speech for him in Houston, a fundraising event. And Long was completely unrepentant. And remember, even then, if you're running in the Democratic primary, you want to be rather careful what you talk about, particularly as a senator from Texas. The Democrats are not exactly in love with the oil and gas industry or certain other or insurance or 2 or 3 other things. So Long got up at this luncheon. He said, I'm so glad y'all are here. Lloyd, if you got a problem with the natural gas, Lloyd's your man on my committee to talk to. You got a problem with the banks, Lloyd's your man. You got a problem, you all in the energy industry, Lloyd understands natural gas and he understands this. So when you need a little consideration for your bills, Lloyd is the kind of guy you can go to. And of course, this made national stories. It's like, oh my God, what's happened? And it was just hysterical. And it was like 2 Democratic parties, and of course, all of the liberals and all of them, they just denounced Benson and called him the senator from Texaco and all the rest of it. But Long didn't care. He just said, Lloyd, it's all right. They need to have a few rational people around. And he was like that. Russell Long was a very, very, very distinguished guy. And he did 2 things in my memory that were extraordinary. One is that he and Benson pioneered the Pension Reform Act that made it fair to retire. And they got rid of some of the abuses in the Pension Reform Act. Long was an advocate, like Huey had been, of what are called ESOPs. These are employee-owned corporations. And those are models today where employees are encouraged to invest in stock in their companies where they work. And the best example of that in American capitalism is when General Motors went under and the strike fund of the UAW put $1.5 billion into stock to recapitalize General Motors. That's a true story. And here's the UAW strike fund investing in GM stock. And I'll say they double their money too. So it was Long encouraged those sorts of things and helped pass the things where corporations and unions would actually invest in the ownership and share the ownership. And today there's a member of the UAW on the board of General Motors,
Yeah. Speaking of Lloyd Benson, here's a question about another Texan. How did LBJ ever come out of a Southern background and go on to be such a
What's a long story?
Society a reformer?
Yeah, it's a long story, and you're going to ask me if I knew him, and I didn't, but I knew Lady Bird quite well. Johnson, when he was young, for a period of time, taught in South Texas at a school for Mexican American kids in Cotula, Texas. And he had experience with poverty as a young person. And he recognized the injustices of Mexican Americans and persons of color at an early age. And he was also taken aback by some of the large public works projects that Long had done in Louisiana. And as a member of Congress, he helped pass some of the key legislation that created the Lower Colorado River Authority and provided electric utilities to all kinds of places. But in the Senate, his friends, and he rose to be majority leader, but his strongest ally in the Senate was Richard Russell from Georgia, who was an ardent segregationist. And of course, Johnson did business with Eastland and all the rest of them. But I think he was moved by some of the civil rights movements when he was president, and he was moved by before the war. His dream was the Great Society. It was in many ways an intellectual heir to some of what Long had in mind. It was the war on poverty, the Great Society, and some other things. And he grew and he saw some of the injustices and decided that he would not want to leave his legacy along with those segregationists. He was also a very good friend, as was Benson, to Congresswoman Barbara Jordan from Houston. And she had a lot to do with his thinking about it. And also, LBJ could count votes. He understood the power of the African-American vote in the big cities running for re-election in 1964. I had a little bit to do with it as well. So he could just count votes, and he understood completely the power of these big cities and so forth. And he had many, many African-American friends, and he put aside a lot of that. And he also brought some of the segregationists around a little bit, where they wouldn't admit it in public, but they understood that change was coming in the South.
And did he fully appreciate what impact that would have over the next generation?
Absolutely. There's a great speech that he gave in Baton Rouge. He believed that the embracing of civil rights by the Democratic Party would empower the Republicans in the South. And he foresaw it, and he observed it. He said the rich people and the whites are going to leave the Democratic Party, and we're going to have a Republican South. But he took the view that it was just the right thing to do. So what, Mm-hmm. So he went forward and never looked back, really, in some ways. There's a famous speech, I can't quote it from memory, but the Baton Rouge speech where he just chewed them all out. He said, all I ever hear, I want to talk about bridges and dams and roads, and all I ever hear is the N-word, the N-word, the N-word. It was a very famous speech that was just outrageous. And Johnson changed in his latter part of his life about some of that stuff, and became a very very dynamic thing. His career was, of course, sidetracked by the war.
Do you see him as a tragic figure?
Yes, I do. I taught, as you know, Charlie, at the LBJ school for 9 years, and I used to, when I was there, I used to refer to the original faculty who had been staffers for LBJ. I used to refer to Lyndon as our spiritual founder, and I would cross myself with the students and always get a laugh. And Gronowski was there, and some of the Rostows were there, and we'd periodically have these little seance meetings to talk about the legacy of LBJ, and all of them were there. And of course, I sort of enjoyed it because I would always prick Rostow around. Walt had been the national security advisor and had picked bombing targets in Vietnam. And one topic was, this is a terrible thing to say, but it's fun. They had a thing was, did Clinton disrespect LBJ when he came to the library? And this was a topic that someone had put together as a library seance when I was teaching there. And both Rostows, Walt Rostow and Elspeth, were there. And I said, well, Walt, I could see how he disrespected. I mean, you ran the bombing game over there in Vietnam. I don't think Clinton wanted to talk about bombing when he came here to the LBJ library. I don't think that'd be a good thing to you. And Rostow, his wife, who also taught there, just kicked me under the table. It was great fun, and so forth. It was Johnson died, I believe, in 1973. His wife, Lady Bird, lived on for another almost 15 years. And I befriended her. She knew that I taught at the school, and we would go out periodically to the ranch. And she was hysterical. She was very witty and quite fun. When the Republicans came in, when Gingrich was speaker, they would not appropriate money for the upkeep of the LBJ ranch on which she was living, which was a national park. And so, Bird, Ms. Johnson, we had a little picnic out there, and for her son-in-law, who was then a senator from Virginia, she had an announcement. She said, I am so honored that you all are here today, because as you know, Mr. Gingrich would not appropriate any money for the ranch. So I have given the ranch to the government and to the Parks and Wildlife Service so that the people can enjoy the ranch. But I am insisting, and I look forward to Mr. Gingrich coming out so he can cut my grass. I want him to cut my grass personally. And she said this in view of a bunch of reporters and so forth. She said, if Mr. Gingrich wants to take my farm, fine, he can come cut my grass. Great. She was quite starchy and just great fun like that. She did not like Republicans generally, and it was great fun. It's great fun.
I think you're most closely identified with the career of Ann Richards. Could you say something about how she put in all that?
Yeah, I did, I guess, two Texas governors, and the most famous one was I did Mark White's work, and Ann was a dear friend. I'll tell you the origin of that story. I'll tell you quickly. When I was in graduate school, part of the reason why I would earn a living is I would do polling, and I did a little state representatives race for somebody named Sarah Weddington, who was the lawyer in Roe v. Wade. And Ann's chief of staff, or Sarah's chief of staff, was then Ann Richards. And fast forward 15 years, and she was getting ready to run for governor. I worked in '88 for Al Gore. I went all over the country with Gore, was his communications director, and came back and she came to see me and said, I need somebody mean and help, and I want to run for governor. Would you help me do it? So I put the campaign together for her and ran all the opposition research and managed a portion of the campaign. It was a pretty wild and woolly thing that we did. And we concluded, basically there were books about it, but I concluded that we couldn't really sell her, but we could cross-examine her opponents.
Is the Biden campaign following that principle too?
No, it's very different. It's a different deal completely. But in Ann's case, she ran against a guy named Clayton Williams, and he was a low-hanging pigeon, as they say down here. Clayton said things like, rape's like the weather, just relax and enjoy it, and things like that. And it was like pretty easy to bust him up. But it was funny how things are the same. He refused to disclose his taxes, and we hung him with that, and he did a number of other things. So Ann was a character. I loved her dearly, and it was a very hard fought race, and it was in many ways in a place like Texas, which is not known for its liberation of women. It was a pioneering thing. It was my luck in politics to work for a number of women candidates, and also a number of Mexican American Latino candidates that were pioneers in that era. And Ann, the previous year I had done a mayor of Dallas, Annette Strauss's mayor of Dallas, and doing a Democratic liberal Jewish mayor in the city that killed Kennedy is a very interesting deal. She was the sister-in-law of Bob Strauss, and she'd won very decisively. And so Ann decided I was the right guy that would help her, and we had a blast doing it. It was quite the show. And Ann was such a ham, and she loved the national press and loved the media, and we ran arguably one of the more negative campaigns in the state that's famous for negative campaigns. And she kind of liked it. She'd go, she'd kind of go, I don't know about all this, George. This is pretty negative stuff y'all are doing, and you and that Bob Squire, and we'd say, Governor, you have to do this. You just have to do this, Ann. Well, I don't know. Y'all just do what you think's right. We'd immediately launch these TV ads, these scurrilous ads. And she'd call back and say, I don't think we ought to be all that negative. I said, sorry, they're on the air now. They're on the air. It's too late. Oh, I'm so bad. But when she won, it was forgiven. It's kind of that way with a lot of them. But she was great. It was a moment, a shining moment in Texas in some ways. It was fun. It was fun. But she was caught in the downdraft of the Clintons, and what really got her, she was very popular. What beat her, she vetoed a gun bill in Texas. This is 1993, and she vetoed a handgun bill, which in Texas, about half the people own a gun. And she just said, I don't think people ought to be carrying pistols, and vetoed it, and it got her beat. And she was very popular. Everybody loved her, but by God, they wanted their guns. Yeah. So it's and she did all right. So anyway, I didn't really work for a living. I mean, I just did stuff I like to do, and hanging around Democratic politics and stuff like that.
Well, you lived through the age of Molly Ivins too.
She was a close friend. Mm-hmm. I am actually a chapter in one of her books, and she coined the phrase about me of Dr. Dirt, and I was somewhat famous for doing opposition research. I'll confess this. Y'all would love this. I hope there's nobody recording all that. There probably are, but I don't really care anymore. The Democratic Party never really did the kind of opposition research that Republicans would do. I knew Lee Atwater very well, and I had actually run races against him, and really began in the early 1980s to understand the value of scholarly research of building an argument, just like a legal theory of a case. And then I used to give lectures to the Democratic National Committee staff and all the Democratic groups about how you build theories of a case. That ultimately the message is the character of the candidate, and you've got to build a theory of character, and you have to understand exactly what you're doing. You do not lie, do not spin, do not make it up, but just understand what you're dealing with. And you try that person and you cross-examine them just as if you would cross-examine a hostile witness in litigation, and in some cases in criminal litigation. And you do that kind of research and understand where they get their money, whose side they're on, are they real, what's the story, not trash. You're not looking for, I don't really care. In this day and age, it doesn't matter about girlfriends or boyfriends or any of that stuff. I look for signs of character weakness, of money, greed, sale of influence, things of that nature. And I used, when I taught at the LBJ school, I would teach a seminar in campaigns that was about that. And what I would argue is there's a place for this, that yeah, it's smash mouth politics. It's a rough and tumble game, but people ought not to be able to lie, cheat, or steal in public life. And it's fair game to raise those issues, and in fact, that's what the framers of the Constitution would have wanted us to do. So just suck it up, Buttercup. It's a tough game out there. And the Democrats, there's something about Democrats that they're over it now, but at the time in the 1980s, it was kind of like, oh my goodness, that's a negative campaign. So is life, So is life.
I think there's a quote we heard from Willie Stark, gimme, 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 my name is Jimmy.
Right.
That was the theme of politics then. And do you think we'll ever live to see a time when money doesn't play that role?
I hope so. I don't know. After Citizens United, of what this Supreme Court has done with opening up the caps on Citizens United, it's going to take a long time, I think, to get the money back under control. The idea that a corporation has the First Amendment rights without the First Amendment liabilities is, which is the core of Citizens United, I think is a terrible, terrible thing. The good news, though, for progressives is that we've mastered the ability to write checks ourselves with the internet. And so that you can see the fruits of so-called new fundraising with all of these US Senate candidates around the country that are raising a lot of money to get control of the Senate. That a lot of, the average contribution to Biden today is less than $30, So and he raised $1 billion from June on. So it's there, people, but there's too much of it, and that we've got to rethink our whole method of how we finance campaigns in this country. But we're not going to get there for a while. It just depends on whether the D's can capitalize on this election or not. And we're going to probably win the Senate. And as I've told you, Charles, and audience out there, I don't know you people, but you're amused. There's certain laws of political thermodynamics that I modestly call Dr. Shipley's laws. The first one is God meant for me to have some money. The second one is never, ever, ever underestimate the ability of Democrats to screw things up at the last minute. Never underestimate that. The third one is never, ever count on the courage of Republicans to do the right thing. Never count on Republicans. So if you keep those laws inevitable, and you understand they should have been in the Federalist Papers. It should have been another Federalist paper.
Well, we've all written those down. Thank you, George. Another question that has come up. What about voter suppression in the South?
It's terrible. It's terrible. The Shelby County case, the Supreme Court in Shelby County, basically, Scalia wrote the concurring opinion to Roberts' majority opinion, where he said that how long are we going to perpetuate a sense of Black entitlement in this country? That was a direct quote from racial entitlement, what Scalia said in Shelby County. After Shelby County, which said basically you don't need the enforcement division of the civil rights of the civil rights departments anymore, that racism is over, all the southern states reenacted a lot of suppression laws. So we're fighting suppression now in 17 states. We got 17 cases in front of the Supreme Court. They're nationwide. The ones that are the most egregious at the moment are Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. But yeah, I mean, Georgia's a disgrace. We have the most restrictive laws here in Texas probably of any state where you can't, you can't, it's a felony for me to hire a bus and take people to get them to vote. If I get my neighbors who decide they want to go to the polling place and I hire an Uber for them, that's a crime. Because that's hauling, it's harvesting votes, and on and on and on. But the people have a way of seeing through it, and this day and era is going to pass. And I do think that Biden will win, and I do think that the Justice Department voting rights folks will be back in business here very shortly. And these states that are somewhat rogue at the moment, I think there'll be some. There's nothing a few good indictments and prosecutions won't cure, And,
well, happy times for lawyers ahead. You mentioned that you'd had some Hispanic candidates in Texas. We're reading a lot now that the Hispanic vote is not reliably Democratic. That there's a strong, not just I'm not talking about just Cubans in Miami, but that particularly Hispanic males are often quite sympathetic to Trump. Is that going to be a problem, or?
Yes, it is and it isn't. First of all, when we talk about the Hispanics, I think everyone understands it's really they're diverse ethnic groups. Not only Cubans and Puerto Ricans in Florida, Mexican Americans in Texas, Mexican Americans in Arizona. There are people from the Caribbean who are Spanish speaking, from Dominica, from some of the islands. So you're talking about different ethnic groups. The problem comes up mostly with Mexican American men. And part of that is the macho culture, and part of it is maybe 25 or 30% of them respect Trump, and they're very conservative in lifestyle. You have to remember that what you see in Washington about the cages and the immigrants and all of that, the Latino population doesn't relate very well to all of those injustices. Those are sort of what I call white liberal issues. That it's jobs and economic opportunity, and most Mexican American families want to join the middle class. They want to educate their kids. They want somebody to deal with on COVID. They want somebody to deal with healthcare generally. And these people aspire to the American dream: home ownership, stable kids. They want their kids to be better than they are in terms of education. And they're really the soul of patriotism and the soul of the country. So that makes them somewhat conservative. White liberals who make a pitch, kind of a patronizing a pitch to them, don't sometimes see that exactly. That it's a whole different pitch, whole different deal. But Trump has united most of the Latinos. I think probably 70% of the Mexican Americans that I've been looking at are going to go for Biden.
We have time for one final question, and I wanted to bring it back to my native state of Louisiana, right. And the Huey Long story and the Willie Stark fictionalized story. It's today, you can go to New Orleans and you feel like you're in a very solid Democratic environment. You can go to even Monroe, where I grew up. It voted for the city. The population of the city voted for Hillary. Last time around, because the population is mostly Black now. All the whites went out. So, but you have a state that is extraordinarily pro-Trump once you get out of these college towns or big city. Is Long in any way responsible for that? Had he survived, would there have been I know this is counterfactual in a way, but could he have established something that would have been a genuinely egalitarian system in a state that in some ways is so, has so many problems?
The agony of the South, Charlie, we've talked about it. The agony of the South is there. Race is a permeate thing. New Orleans is wonderful because the African American people of color in New Orleans are very sophisticated and very politically hip and very empowered and so forth. But you go north to Alexandria, you go north to Louisiana. I used to poll Louisiana quite a bit. And I used to have clients that would pay a group of us to keep race out of the governor's races in Louisiana and to not demagogue the issue. And there was a group called the Coldwater Committee, a bunch of characters that are long gone, but who really were trying to move past racial polarization in Louisiana. And they would hire pretty good talent. We try to figure out how to make arguments that would put it aside. The politics of race crippled the South. They've crippled the politics, Mississippi, in some ways, and it's hard to move forward, to make investments in higher education and in human services skills, and to create a social network, and to create an enlightened politics where people move to the center as opposed to the fringes, where it's not just who can holler the loudest or who can be closest to Jesus and all the rest of it, but who can actually bring about constructive change. Those days long might have been able to do it, but it would have come back. The fear of rural America and fear of the unknown and fear of violence and all the rest of it. You just have to get prejudice out and talked about, and educate the kids and educate everybody, and get it in the conversation. The nature of prejudice, racial prejudice or religious prejudice, as you know, well, is that it's secret. We hide it. We're ashamed of it, and you have to get that out in the open and get people to understand it and understand that it's just stupid,
George, thank you so very much. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll welcome you back with the other panelists. And
thank you. Well, I'm honored you think of me anyway. Thank you.
See you in 5 minutes.
All right.